Imagine you're a fruit bat. Stay with me here. You're hanging upside down in a fig tree somewhere in tropical West Africa, and the figs around you are past their prime, soft, split, dripping with a faint sweetness that smells almost sharp. You eat them anyway, because that's what's available, and because the ones that smell like that tend to be the most calorie-dense. You eat until you're full, and then you try to fly home, and something is slightly off. Your echolocation is a little fuzzy. Your turns are wider than usual. You make it back, but barely. Now imagine the same thing happening to a primate ancestor of yours, 50 million years ago in a tropical forest. Fermented fruit. Elevated ethanol content. A body that can either process that ethanol or die trying. And over millions of generations, the lineage that processes it efficiently survives to reproduce, and the one that can't, doesn't. No decision was made. No preference was formed in any conscious sense. The biology just drifted, shaped by the simple pressure of what was edible and what wasn't. That's the part of the alcohol story that almost nobody tells. Not the history of brewing, not the social rituals, not the ancient trade routes. The part that starts before civilization, before agriculture, before language, the part that starts in the genes themselves. And that's exactly where we're going today. The question of why humans crave alcohol is usually treated as a cultural or psychological puzzle. People drink because of stress, because of social pressure, because advertising works, because trauma goes untreated. All of that is real. None of it is the whole story. The more you dig into the evolutionary biology underneath the behavior, the more you realize that the craving isn't an accident of modern excess or a product of weak character or a simple failure of self-control. It's a signal, an ancient signal that made perfect sense in the environment it was built for, running at full volume in an environment it was never designed to navigate. What this video is actually about is the mismatch between ancient wiring and modern conditions, and why that mismatch is one of the most underappreciated forces shaping human behavior in the 21st century. The alcohol angle is the entry point, but the principle it illustrates applies to sugar, to pornography, to social media, to the entire landscape of modern addictive behavior. Understanding why our ancestors were drawn to ethanol, on a biological level, is understanding something fundamental about what it means to have a brain built for one world and forced to live in another. We're going to work through 4 interlocking ideas. First, the actual evolutionary mechanics. What happened to primate genetics over millions of years and why? Second, the dopamine system, and how a reward circuit built to track rare nutritional windfalls became the architecture that modern addiction exploits. Third, the specific way early human cultures both amplified and ritualized the craving, using social and religious structure as an imperfect brake on what biology was accelerating. And fourth, because this story demands it, the hard question of who benefits from treating a deeply biological phenomenon as a purely moral failure. Let's go back to the genetics, because the numbers here are genuinely worth sitting with. In 2015, a team led by Matthew Kerrigan at Santa Fe College published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that reconstructed the ancestral forms of a specific enzyme, alcohol dehydrogenase 4, or ADH4, going back roughly 70 million years through the primate lineage. What they found was that a key mutation in ADH4 occurred approximately 10 million years ago, during a period that corresponds with a significant climate shift in Africa. As the forests contracted and our ancestors were pushed increasingly toward ground-level foraging, the available food shifted too. More fallen, fermenting fruit. More naturally occurring ethanol in the diet. The mutation made ADH4 roughly 40 times more efficient at breaking down ethanol than the version found in earlier primates. 40 times. That is not a marginal upgrade. That is the difference between a compound being a poison and being a manageable, even calorie-positive, part of the diet. The lineages without the mutation couldn't exploit fermenting fruit efficiently. The lineages with it could. Over millions of years, that advantage compounded. By the time Homo sapiens arrived, this upgraded ethanol metabolism was simply the standard equipment. Here is the implication that usually gets skipped in the telling of this story. The craving came with the capacity. Not in the sense that ancient hominins were stumbling around drunk. The ethanol levels in naturally fermenting fruit are relatively low, nothing like distilled spirits, but in the sense that the sensory and reward signals associated with ripe, high-calorie, fermenting fruit were baked into the neurology. The sweet, sour, yeasty smell of fermentation became, over evolutionary time, a signal for something valuable, something worth moving toward, something worth remembering the location of. That's not a cultural preference. That's a foraging instinct. And foraging instincts are among the oldest and most deeply embedded drives in the mammalian repertoire. Now pair that ancient foraging instinct with what we know about the dopamine system, and the picture gets considerably more complicated. Dopamine is not, as popular science tends to frame it, the pleasure chemical. That's a simplification that leads people badly astray when they're trying to understand their own behavior. Dopamine is more precisely the anticipation and motivation chemical. It surges not when you get the reward, but when you're moving toward it. It's the neurological engine of wanting, not of having. And it evolved, in the context of foraging behavior, to prioritize exactly the kinds of signals that indicated rare, high-density caloric payoffs. Robert Sapolsky, the Stanford neuroendocrinologist, has spent decades tracing the ways in which dopamine shapes behavior in primates. One of his more striking findings, reproducible across multiple species, is that the dopamine response is actually stronger and more persistent when the reward is uncertain. Not absent, not guaranteed, uncertain. A lever that delivers food pellets on a variable schedule produces more compulsive lever pressing than one that delivers them reliably. The uncertainty keeps the dopamine system in a state of sustained arousal, continuing to predict, continuing to motivate, continuing to push the organism toward the next potential payoff. Now think about what that means in the context of alcohol and the ancient environment. Fermenting fruit was not guaranteed. It was seasonal, location-dependent, and variable in quality. Finding it required memory, effort, and navigation. The dopamine surge associated with locating it, consuming it, and absorbing its calories was exactly calibrated by evolutionary pressure to make that kind of rare, effortful payoff feel extraordinarily significant. The brain lit up for a reason. The problem is that the dopamine system cannot tell the difference between a ripe fig dripping with natural fermentation products and a glass of whiskey. The chemical stimulus hits the same receptors, activates the same circuits, releases the same cascade of motivational arousal. The brain that evolved to find fermenting fruit on the floor of an African forest is, when exposed to concentrated ethanol in a modern setting, responding to a superstimulus, a signal so far beyond the range it was calibrated for that all the usual moderating signals get overwhelmed. The stop mechanism was built for a world where you might find 3 fermented figs if you were lucky. It was not built for a world where you can buy a bottle of rum at a gas station at 2 a.m. That's not a personal failing. That's an engineering problem. The hardware is running software it was never designed to handle. Early human cultures, to their considerable credit, figured this out, at least partially, without any understanding of the underlying neuroscience. They couldn't have articulated the dopamine system or the ADH4 mutation, but they could observe consequences. And what they built, across dozens of different civilizations, were social and ritual structures that functioned as external brakes on what the biology was accelerating. Consider the Mesopotamians. The Sumerians were probably the first civilization to produce beer at industrial scale, and they did it within a social framework that was remarkably deliberate about who drank, when, and how much. The goddess Ninkasi, the divine patron of brewing, was not just a religious figure. She was the symbolic anchor for a set of practices and norms that governed fermented drink as a socially managed resource rather than an individual consumer good. Beer rations were part of the labor compensation system, distributed at specific times in measured quantities as part of a managed daily diet. Workers received beer. They did not receive unlimited access to the brewery. The ancient Egyptians operated a similar model. Beer was nutritional, ritualistic, and rationed. Medical papyri from the Middle Kingdom period, around 2000 to 1700 BCE, include dozens of prescriptions that incorporate beer as a carrier for herbal medicines, which tells you something about how differently they categorized the substance. It was not recreation. It was not vice. It was a managed resource with specific approved applications. Even the Greek symposium, which gets romanticized as a boozy philosophical free-for-all, was actually a quite structured social technology. Wine was always diluted with water, typically at a ratio of 2 or 3 parts water to 1 part wine. A dedicated symposiarch, appointed for each gathering, set the dilution ratio and the pace of the evening. Drinking undiluted wine was considered barbaric, literally the behavior of people outside the civilized order. The ritual structure of the symposium was, among other things, a social mechanism for moderating a biological drive that the Greeks clearly understood could get away from people without oversight. What all of these structures share is a recognition, encoded in social norms rather than scientific vocabulary, that the human appetite for ethanol needed to be managed rather than simply indulged or suppressed. The cultures that survived long enough to leave detailed records had, in almost every case, developed some form of ritualized moderation. That's not coincidence. That's selection pressure operating at the cultural level. Here's the part that deserves more scrutiny than it usually gets. The framing of alcohol craving as a moral weakness, as a failure of willpower, a defect of character, a spiritual problem, is not ancient. It's actually a relatively recent development in the broader sweep of human history, most forcefully articulated in the context of 19th-century Protestant reform movements in the United States and Britain. The temperance movement, which eventually produced prohibition in the U.S. in 1920, operated on a framework that treated the desire for alcohol as a personal failing that could be overcome through sufficient faith and determination. The individual was the unit of analysis. The biology was invisible. That framing was not just scientifically wrong. It was enormously convenient for certain interests. If excessive drinking is a moral failure, then the solution is moral reform, not public health infrastructure, not economic policy, not changes to how alcohol is marketed, priced, or distributed. The responsibility lands entirely on the individual, which means the systems that profit from selling alcohol bear no particular burden. The moral framework, whatever its origins in genuine religious concern, has the practical effect of insulating a multi-hundred-billion-dollar industry from structural accountability. This is not an argument that individuals have no agency. They do. But agency operates on a spectrum, and it operates differently depending on the biological load a person is carrying. Research from the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism has consistently found significant genetic variation in alcohol use disorder risk. Some people's dopamine systems are measurably more reactive to ethanol than others. Some people's ADH2 variants metabolize acetaldehyde less efficiently, producing more pronounced negative feedback. And some people are neurologically wired in ways that make the moderating signals much harder to hear above the motivational noise. Telling people with high genetic vulnerability to simply choose better is about as sophisticated as telling someone with type 1 diabetes to try harder at producing insulin. The evolutionary story doesn't remove responsibility, but it does reframe where the work of managing this drive should be concentrated. Which brings us back to that fruit bat in the fig tree, and to what the whole arc of this story is really pointing toward. The craving for ethanol is old, older than our species, older than our genus. It's a signal that has been running in the background of primate neurology for roughly 10 million years, and it spent almost all of that time serving a completely legitimate function, pointing organisms toward calorie-dense, nutritionally valuable food sources in an environment where those sources were genuinely scarce. The problem is not the signal. The problem is the gap between the world the signal was calibrated for and the world we've built. This is the central tension of the modern human condition, and alcohol is just one of the more obvious examples of it. The dopamine systems that drive us toward sugar were calibrated for a world where sweet things were rare and seasonal. The social comparison circuits that drive status anxiety were calibrated for a world where your peer group was 50 people you saw every day, not 50 million strangers on the internet. The novelty-seeking drives that made our ancestors excellent explorers make the average modern person a target for every algorithm ever written. We are, in virtually every direction, running ancient hardware in an environment designed to exploit it. Understanding that this is the situation, not through self-pity, but with the clear-eyed recognition that most of us are fighting a structural mismatch, not just a personal weakness, changes the quality of the conversation. It changes what solutions look like. It changes who we hold accountable and for what. And it changes the way we think about the people in our lives who seem unable to moderate behaviors that, from the outside, look like simple choices. The ancient world didn't have neuroscience, but it had observation, and it had the cultural wisdom to build structures around the drives it couldn't eliminate. We have the science now. The question is whether we're willing to use it honestly, or whether we'll keep pretending that 10 million years of evolutionary pressure can be overcome by wanting it enough. Before 1000 exists because these questions don't get asked often enough, and because the people who ask them deserve actual answers rather than comfortable ones. If you want to keep going deeper into the biology and history underneath human behavior, the real roots of why we do what we do, subscribe. And leave a comment with this. What other modern behavior do you think is really just an ancient drive meeting an environment it wasn't built for? Because that list is longer than most people want to admit, and I think we should talk about it.